I don't hear it anyway.
Yeah, I also have this darn near magic and amazing microphone set up. Hello, we're live. This is about 2 minutes for us to just say hello and do rapport-ish kind of things, like, how was your day? Did you have a good breakfast? It's kind of, I did. I had a great breakfast.
Well, that's nice because I didn't.
Uh-huh.
I was out
Okay.
of almond milk.
Okay. I'm getting a reflection that's about 20 seconds behind. Very good. Good that I'm reporting a good thing.
And we had a salesperson at the house today for
Oh,
breakfast
do
time.
tell. Okay, what were they selling?
A fireplace insert. They were very good. It was very instructive, and I hadn't done any research. It's really my partner kind of driving the bus on this, so I had done zero research on fireplace inserts. And this sales rep was, just an excellent communicator and really met us where we were, and not a
I
wasted
love learning
word.
from good communicators.
Yes, yeah, it was really nice.
Fireplace inserts. Is that the price to get good communication training? Probably.
They're a little more high dollar than I had bargained for, but maybe that is the price.
Maybe. I've heard prices for like kitchen remodel, and it blew my little freaking mind, and was something like 10x what I figured that the the stuff costs. So how is it 90x installation? That's weird. Or how much? Anyway, quiet time. Welcome to this session of Vanilla Street Epistemology. My guest today is Dan Art.
Hello.
Dan doesn't have a YouTube channel for you to go look up or any of those other things. They just met me on the Discord, and we've had a couple of SE conversations. So take it that we've had a good bit of rapport build, and that we're gonna just dive right in. So, what kind of a claim are we going to explore today?
Well, the claim, I have to read it here. The claim is a kind of a modified version of a claim I've been really interested in exploring with SE folks, and both as a questioner really and as a IL. But the claim is this: it is useful for my projects and interests to evaluate factual claims in terms of their usefulness for human circumstances and interests. And then I put in parentheses, instead of evaluating them in terms of their correspondence to reality.
Okay. Are these, I may be overlapping from sometimes we've talked about a little bit in the past.
Yes.
In the audience say, oh, you misunderstood. He didn't say anything like that. I might be remembering. So I'll try not to.
Okay. Yep.
Is this claims that other people make, claims you make, or both? If you're evaluating claims of truth, are these relative to the source or from any source?
I think I would say from any source, mostly from other people. Well,
okay, mostly from other people.
Yes, because that's what it gets into the. I want to try to position this not as a factual claim in its own right.
That's fine. Well, right. What I hear you claiming is that you have a strategy, and you think that strategy serves an end goal.
Yes. Yes.
Cool. That's no problem. I can ROM claim right that in there.
Okay.
I'll just pull out of my ROM package and we'll throw it right in. So, it's useful for you to evaluate incoming truth claims based upon their utility and not try to establish whether they correspond with reality?
Yes.
Okay. Um, could a claim be both useful and true?
Could a claim be both useful and true? Well, I think if a claim could be useful, that's as far as my interest would be in it, and then it would be what is it useful for?
Right.
The truth piece is
I've got 4 questions.
okay.
The column is useful, not useful, true, not true.
Oh,
So I'm going to ask the 4 questions in there and just figure out where the overlaps are. It's for my Boolean thinking. So could a claim be both useful? Is it useful if I claim that that water is by count 1 part oxygen, 2 parts hydrogen by molecular count?
is it useful?
Yeah,
Well, I think for most circumstances, just on average, I think we would find that useful
good.
for
Is it
just
true?
technical.
Right.
Well, the thing that okay, so I'm interested in trying to see what it's like
Hmm.
to not work with the correspondence theory of truth. So
Okay,
that's the
just
thing.
ignore whether or not it's true.
Well, it's
I'm sorry.
yeah,
I use the word. Ignore whether or not it corresponds with reality. Pay attention to its utility only.
yes, right.
Okay. Could you give me an example of a truth that is useful that people would not generally agree corresponds with reality?
Well, other people might agree that it corresponds with reality in their
Hmm.
analysis. So
Okay.
all sorts of basic claims. We could use the one that you said. I forgot what it is already, but a more simple thing might be,
Oh, it could
the
be even simpler. I just
yeah,
picked one that people know in chemistry.
yeah. We could say the moon
Hmm.
revolves around the Earth, or the
Sure.
moon orbits the Earth. We could say, I'm sitting in my dining room right now. Uh,
Yeah.
we could say. I live on a street, not an avenue. I don't know.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
And so those
Street,
are,
not an avenue. That might be really hard to nail down whether it corresponds with reality. It might correspond with what's written on the signs.
well, the correspondence question is really kind of like it really interests me
Hmm.
because I tend to think of it as itself sort of like an axiomatic tool. It's hard to measure any correspondence is kind of something that I'm interested in exploring, and that's part of
Hmm.
what it's sort of like wrapped up into this um
Is it
wrapped
true
up
that I'm
into this point.
smaller than the typical African elephant?
Well, I would say that I think is a useful sentence for a lot of
Okay.
human projects and circumstances. It's just whether that sentence corresponds with anything in any sort of measurable way is what I'm sort of interested. You know,
Oh,
I
okay.
think a lot of times a person can say, well, it corresponds with reality, but I think, from my perspective, with this sort of experimental claim, it's like, well,
Hmm.
I think it's useful, but I
Hmm.
don't see the correspondence. I can't take a ruler to this human sentence and measure anything in it, and then go and
Hmm.
measure something else like your size and the elephant size and come to I don't see any similarity there, which is sometimes when we talk about correspondence, maybe we think,
Hmm.
oh, there's like some similarity between the sentence
Now it's
and
interesting.
what the sentence purports to
Um,
be about or something.
so I'm gonna try to get simpler and simpler until there isn't a distinction. Is it useful for me to believe that 2 plus 2 is 4?
Yes, for most circumstances in projects and interests you might have,
Sure.
it's almost always going to be yes. I
Okay.
mean, you can
Good.
think of really off the wall circumstances where such an idea may
Sure.
not be useful to you. You can come up with like, oh, you're in a tyrannical government and the ruler
Yes.
has decreed, and then he's going to kill you and your family if you don't agree that
Right.
2 and 2 equals 5.
Right.
Or you can come up with all sorts of outlandish hypothetical situations.
Sure.
But
It
on
might be
average,
useful for me to believe that crossing the freeway is dangerous because demons will come inhabit my soul,
yes,
which is, by the way, I don't believe that corresponds with reality, but I do believe that if I were act as if that's the case, it would be very useful. It's one of those
yes.
examples of a noble truth. And I'm sorry, I'm introducing jargon that's not helpful. All right. So for your projects, it is useful for you to hold this strategy. What would be the alternate strategy? I think you said it would be testing truth claims against correspondence.
Oh, well, I guess what I meant there with the first part, like it is useful by projects and interests, is just much more broad. It's sort of like, for many years, I suppose like a lot of people maybe in the street epistemology community, it's like I'm interested in these questions of how do they put it, life, the universe, and everything. Just these big philosophical, many, many, many years.
Somebody's typing 42 somewhere. I know that.
Many. I've just been interested in these questions and everything, and I have found this sort of type of claim to be in itself sort of useful for my sort of like musings and my approaches to different kind of these bigger questions and such like that. I would also say that I think that's one sort of important category, how it's useful for my interests. Another sort of like category is, believe it or not, sort of like in my day-to-day relationships with people, especially when there's conflict, like at work, for example. I can have work conflicts with people, and there's been times where my work conflicts can be pretty distressing and disruptive to me. It's like I come home at night and it's like I can't think of anything else because I'm just thinking of this darn thing that happened with this person at work, sometimes for a long time, and it's that's frustrating. So on further analysis, a lot of times there's a piece involved in this disagreement where I'm corresponding some part of my analysis of this work disagreement where I am thinking that it's my idea is corresponding with reality. And a lot of times if I can sort of ferret that out and I can sort of like look at it from the perspective of this claim, that sheds new light on the question and sheds a very different perspective, and oftentimes sort of like suggests a solution or a way forward, and I can sort of get past whatever I was having this big problem about.
Okay, so correspondence with reality ends up being something like a thought terminating cliche. It runs you into but I'm right, and without and while your claim might correspond with reality, it might be useful to let them try their mode, and maybe you don't know that theirs is wrong. Something that, or maybe allows you
Something
to
like that.
achieve compromise where you wouldn't have otherwise, because you were trying to come to an objective, measurable thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It might just be me,
Okay.
just having being less self-righteous at sometimes, for example, where I think a lot of times I might think that my take on the situation is something that would be shared by all people. But then it's kind of like, well, the different people who go through this if they were in my shoes, they might not have the same response that I'm having. And based on their life experience and sort of what they're bring to the table, they might not have like this. And so that has been a problem for me where I think, oh, my read of this work conflict is obviously right. And everybody would see that if they were in my shoes and if they understood the problem right. But I think that that's a pretty flawed approach. And just for me to sort of recognize that helps me get a perspective on
Would this approach work for people who work for Elon?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Maybe.
I've heard from those employees that they do not argue with opinions, they refute with data, and they don't refute until they have data, and lots of things like that.
Okay.
Although that's a little bit of anecdote. I don't really know what it's like in that community.
Sure.
Okay. So in my life, well, first of all, I definitely agree. My default position, my default emotional state would be self-righteous and overcertain. And I have to constantly gratefully remind myself that even if I'm really sure I'm right, I shouldn't be sure I'm right. And even if I'm right, doesn't mean I should win. Doesn't mean somebody should take my opinion and run with it. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really resonate with what you're talking about. It's
Okay.
this goes really well with my own like constant grind with myself regarding intellectual humility.
Yeah.
I keep recognizing that the long-term trend for my intellectual humility is on the downslope, and I guess that means in the Dunning-Kruger I'm reaching the middle. That valley of humility in the middle somewhere. Anyway, so imagine I've got Nad. Nad is the reverse of Dan.
Okay.
And Nad thinks that the most important thing about our beliefs is that they are true, and that allowing people to be satisfied with a truth only because it's useful leads to corruption, horribleness, and demons attacking their soul. Okay, maybe not that last part, but they're strongly against this idea.
Right.
How do I choose between the two of you?
Okay. Let's see. So Nad would be a person who would be very deeply committed to correspondence theory. It
Yeah.
would be very committed to the idea that the sentence, the moon orbits the Earth,
Yes.
somehow has like this relationship with what's happening out there. Okay, so that view, I think, to be deeply committed to correspondence is also helpful and useful. This is where it gets a little tricky.
Oh, this is fun. I love this.
This is, I mean, I think it's obviously useful for people, because that's why I think it's a very commonly held position, and it's a very common tool that people use to sort of like navigate the world and experience and life and all that. It's a useful, the correspondence theory of truth, or thinking that a sentence does correspond, is a useful tool for many projects and circumstances. And so it's really kind of like a question of, well, if you're sort of a person and you're trying to decide between, do you want to jump into this experiment that I'm doing, that Dan is doing, where I'm going to see what it's like to think that it's useful for my projects and interests to evaluate factual claims in terms of their usefulness. Do I want to do that as an experiment, or do I want to jump in with the idea that there is like a special relationship between sentences and our claims and the world? I think the person sort of has to evaluate for themselves, what is the circumstance, what are the projects in what are the sort of like projects of the moment that they're interested in, what are their more sort of like long-term projects and goals and interests, and they can look at it and see which of these they think is going to serve not only their personal projects, but also what's going to be best for the community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can sort of like do this cost-benefit analysis. It's a complicated cost-benefit analysis. Just a lot of terms and parameters to kind of like start pulling into to putting this cost benefit analysis together. And from my sort of side, I don't necessarily think there's any definitive way to say what is the correct cost-benefit analysis to even be doing. Like, is there a way to say these are the correct parameters for my cost-benefit analysis? I mean, it's all sort of like based on judgment, and
I think it depends on the context.
Yeah, so it's complicated.
I think in some cases it's pretty here.
Yeah, it's a complicated
question from the audience.
Okay.
Does this apply to ordinary mundane things or more extraordinary claims? Is there a difference between I have a dog and I have a Ferrari?
Does this apply? Well, the experiment that this sort of like claim that I experiment with, it would just apply to claims all across the board.
All of the claims. Okay.
Sure.
Another question. There's a lot of science that is useless for years until the use for it changes our lives. How does that fit? Is there a usefulness in quantum theory before we had transistors? That's maybe not a great analogy. Hopefully it's illustrative.
Yeah, no, I think I understand the question. Well, okay, so when a person's doing a cost-benefit analysis about whether they want to work with this claim, so it's like some claim in science that's being made. Maybe you think of like string theory or something. It's very, very debatable. It's
Sure.
very, there's not super strong evidence. I don't know a lot about these like really esoteric fields of physics, but you can think of like social uses for it. You can think of whatever math people are solving with string theory, that's a use. Whatever sort of like, if there's funding available for people to be getting grants to study string theory, and you want to get said grant, you can choose to work with the ideas of string theory and get those grants. And if it's helpful for your career, that's also a use more on like the social side, as much as the technical side. I think you could bring in the hope or possibility of usefulness that you haven't realized yet. So you can have, if you have this feeling like, well, I can't make this idea useful for me today, but I just have this feeling that it's going to be useful at some time in the future. You can bring that into your cost-benefit analysis if you want. Again, the cost-benefit analysis can get awfully complicated and weird,
Okay. Imagine that I can produce some carefully crafted propaganda in order to manipulate a whole lot of people to work against their interests and toward mine. Is that useful?
Yes. I mean, and again, it comes into these cost-benefit analysis, like what are these sort of like broad social goals that the propagandist has? Are the goals of the propagandist what the broader community supports? I'm sorry, I'm having a cat issue. That is a very good question. And I think that I've sort of like suggested that this is one way to sort of look at things. And you could look at you could have a correspondence sort of orientation, or you could have this sort of orientation that I'm experimenting with. Neither of those orientations is really going to stop people from engaging in sort of like what I might consider unethical propaganda practices. So both orientations, my orientation doesn't really solve that problem of people engaging in propaganda and manipulating people. But I also don't think that the correspondence...
It seems like the propaganda opening is probably the thing you'd want to defend against the most. It's the one that NAD has on you. NAD is not allowing that propaganda.
Well, I'm not sure. It's a good question. And, I've used this sort of like this claim as a tool to address a number of different domains and parts of experience and everything. I haven't got around to doing all of them. And I appreciate the propaganda question because I haven't thought through it specifically. But I have a feeling that it wouldn't necessarily like be fatal to my interest in pursuing this experiment. Given time, I'm fairly confident that there
might even be ways in which you can define propaganda as long-term less useful, in some way useless.
Yes.
Therefore, edited out through a secondary pass or something.
Yes. Right. It comes into these questions of the sort of like cost benefit analysis and what you're bringing into those equations. Again, sort of like there's sort of like long-term goals or short-term goals. There's individual goals versus social goals.
Sure.
The collective. And so that is a tricky question.
So I've got 4 categories of things, and they're all flowing in, and you and Nat are going to sort them into your categories. and so there's a bunch of things where both you and Nat are gonna thumbs up, and both you and Nat are gonna thumbs down. I'm looking for the places where it's like this, where it's different, where a choice would be made based upon this strategy that would be different between somebody who's in my head I've got Nad as autistic and maybe even me and like over focused on what's real.
So the question is, where do you think if Nad
I'm looking for examples where the where you and Nad would disagree about a thing, where you would say it's good and Nad would say it's bad, or you would say it's bad and Nad would say it's good.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think you could have a street epistemology good question drinking game. Like, oh, that's a good question.
Oh
Okay.
man, it would be alcohol poisoning. I hang around with some incredible street epistemologists. I would never be sober.
Okay. So I'm going to just process this question for a minute here. A time where I would be interested in an idea, or working with sort of like a claim where maybe Nad would look at it and be disinterested because he feels like it's in his perspective, it's so obviously not correspondent with reality. Yeah, I think that's great. So you could look at I'm trying to think of a time where a person, maybe is using like a useful thing. I think you brought up an interesting example of the it's not safe to go into the woods because there's monsters out there or something.
Okay.
Might be a time where, I would be, just on my analysis, I might have a differently nuanced view of, why I think it's okay for a person to engage in some sort of like magical thinking, whereas Nad maybe would have less nuance. So if a person is going to sort of like have some sort of like magical thinking belief in what would my tolerance for it might be different, because I'm going to bring in different sort of like parameters for the cost benefit analysis, whereas Nad is going to have a different strategy for evaluating the claim altogether. So I think there would be sort of like disagreements in that sense, or differences between Nad and myself in that sense. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. I guess I didn't think of an example.
I think you've defined the category very well. I'm going to note that Elon agrees with you to a degree. I'm not using Elon as the standard. It's just somebody
that's okay.
and who speaks on these things. Elon says it's really good to go from physics first principles, but if you do it all the time, you can't get across the room. And so Nad would be stuck at the threshold in an infinite loop. Well, you strode across, took some approximations, and reached the goal. Right.
And that's one of the main benefits of this perspective by previous philosophers who have brought it up, is that it does well support the generations of creative solutions to problems that confront humanity, in a way that is different than maybe how the creative problem solving would be approached in like the more correspondence orientation. And I do think that it's interesting because we had been talking about Elon before we started the show, but that's an interesting example because
I'm an Elon fan, so it comes up. That's my.
I heard I listened to that Lex Fridman podcast sometimes, and he's a fanboy of Elon, and he is always trying to think of like, what can I do to be more creative and like Elon, and think through so I can get these like really creative ideas and stuff. And I And I've actually suggested just through different social media channels and stuff to Lex. It's like, Lex, you could practice to see what it's like to just let go of correspondence theory as much as you're able to do and see what it's like. And it is very helpful for creative problem solving. It opens things up. And that's part of the question of, like, in the bigger social question of, if we do a cost benefit analysis of this sort of orientation versus correspondence orientation, like I said before, correspondence is useful. There's no doubt about it. But depending on how you're setting up your parameters, the solution that the approach that I'm suggesting here may have net benefits over time for humanity. And that can change based on circumstance. So like burning carbon fuels has been extremely useful for humanity for a very long time, for heat and for power generation. But now, because of changing,
it'll kill us. We just don't know how soon.
Well, sure, and changing circumstances are changing the cost benefit analysis to continuing to burn carbon fuels on an industrial scale. So the circumstances change the cost benefit analysis, which I think is kind of interesting to think about.
Okay, so in your company, I'm going to wave a magic wand, and I'm going to make you and Nad the CEOs of this company.
Okay.
And then there's a third one. This is sort of like a Larry and Sergey kind of. I'm going to make you the masters of it, the executives.
Okay.
And you get to decide what category of things you're going to decide and what category of things Nad's going to decide. What do you let Nad decide? Is there a category where the difference wouldn't matter, or maybe they would do better?
Okay. Well, there probably is, especially in the year 2021 in the United States where I live, in a major city. The person who's kind of working with correspondence theory will have areas where it works really well. In a team, for example, if the rest of the team at work is strong, maybe you're engineers and they're all strong correspondences, it's going to be easier for Nad to just have rapport with that team, because he's not going to be like me trying to explain to them this sort of exotic experimental approach to epistemology and truth. So, and that's worth calculating, because that social piece is super important. On the technical side, I think there's still plenty of times where there's just no problem thinking of in correspondence terms. We see it all over. I think the vast majority of people do. If you're building a bridge, if you're engineering any number of things, I think you can get by just fine with correspondence theory. It can be very motivating to people. Like, if people are motivated, I think a lot of times feeling like basically we're in the sciences now instead of an engineering firm. People are motivated. I think a lot of people, based on their feeling that they are discovering truth and that they are seeking truth. I hear people talking about that all the time. It's like a big motivator for people to investigate and research and explore. And that's important. Some people might not feel so motivated if they sort of let go of their correspondence idea, and they were only going in for, well, it's going to be feel motivated by thinking that I am going to discover truth. So I think those are some areas that, but again, it's sort of like part of our circumstance. That might not be the case 1,000 years from now. This culture might be so different that my answers to that question might be different in 1,000 years.
Sure. Absolutely.
Oh, I'm okay. Thanks.
Good. Question from the audience is, could it be useful to believe something like what Reiki claims to do, which is affect stress and pain levels by laying hands on a person, even if it were not demonstrable?
Well, I think it's probably useful if you're selling Reiki. So again, the usefulness, anybody who's looking at the question of the usefulness of Reiki or not, can bring in their own sort of parameters for doing that cost benefit analysis. So a Reiki practitioner might not be thinking of when they do the cost benefit analysis, they might not be thinking of a long-term what's good or bad for the collective good. They might be thinking more of like what's good for me as a practitioner, a business person, and what's good for my clients who are already sort of like deep believers in Reiki. If they kind of like limit their cost benefit analysis to those parameters, then I think they're going to come out and say, yes, it's useful for me to believe that Reiki works, whether or not it's been proven in labs. A person from the SE community or from any other community, a broader brush of cost benefit analysis and say,
I got discorded. Could you say, could you start again from a person from the SE community? That's where it went silent.
Sure. A person from like a secular community or anybody else for that matter could come in and do their own evaluation of the usefulness of believing in Reiki and use different cost benefit parameters. They say, well, in my observation, humanity is better off in the long run, not really believing things that aren't well established by laboratory experiments. That would be a different cost benefit analysis, and they would come in and say, based on this analysis, I think it's not useful to believe that Reiki is beneficial because it hasn't been shown in labs. So I think that's how I would answer the question. It really depends on the analysis.
It depends on the perspective. So this usefulness thing is allowed to be brought down to an arbitrarily defined subjective perspective.
Well, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Is it good for the company? Is it good for the team? Is it good for my bonus at the end?
Yes.
Is this good for my kids? Things like that. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So let's see.
Oh, that's a great freeze frame.
Am I unfrozen? Have I returned?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. I think that was on my end. Have you always thought that this was the case? This utility?
No. No, I got interested in this much more specifically, probably a little less than 2 years ago.
Okay.
From reading Richard Rorty.
Okay.
I had a very long time interest in questions of life, the universe, and everything. And I can see sort of flourishes of this approach historically, but I never had exposure to the really sort of like well-articulated version of it. I could never have articulated by myself prior to 2 years ago. You know, it was me just being frustrated with a lot of the different, feeling like, oh, I just can't find any philosophy or any approach to these questions that really I feel like is sort of like nailing it, you know, and for me. And then I did find it, and it's been really great. So
yeah, I feel a similar thing in my history when I let go of deterministic arguments. That for me, a couple of years back, I embraced induction as my highest form of confidence, and removed deduction, if it's deduction only, as being something that's too easy to get the math wrong on. I don't throw out induction. I'm sorry, I don't throw out deduction as being necessarily true, but I find far too many examples where deductive logic apparently leads to ridiculous conclusions. And therefore I don't trust the premises going in general, even if I can't tell what the flaw is in the premises.
Yeah.
So I have a similar thing. And it might be in the other direction, but maybe not, because induction is very much a usefulness, and it's about predictive and statistics. It's not about what necessarily is right now, and it's guesses, and it's low confidence, and it's all those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool. So hypothetically, what could you learn? What kind of thing would improve your confidence that usefulness was a better strategy overall?
What could I learn that increase my confidence?
Yep.
That's a good question. I think something that would bolster, and I'm really embarrassed to say it, but I'm going to anyway. I think something that it's been kind of a lonely path. I don't find a lot of people who are sort of jumping into the deep end of this pool with me, even though I'm not shy about talking about it. And I should say I have found people who are interested, but it's sometimes people that I'm then not interested in sort of like socializing with. So if there's more people that sort of like got interested in it and jumped in, then I would say I would be kind of like, okay, now I do feel even more confident that this is useful, and I feel like I'm onto something. I'm on a good path here, which I appreciate.
Okay.
Yeah,
that is a great hypothetical.
It
if you could get a bunch more traction with other thinkers, then it would improve your confidence. If you could get the reflection back that other people would come to the same conclusion given similar data.
Yes.
Nice. Yeah. Obviously, I'm, that's a slippery slope to an argument for popularity, but I think for a lot of these things, especially when we're talking about normative claims or strategic claims, I think popularity should at least influence our confidence, not necessarily lead us to an extreme confidence.
Yeah. It would be nice just to have those creative minds grinding on these different. You can take this idea and sort of apply it to all these different domains, and sometimes you have to really sit and think through. Okay, how does this apply to this question, or how does this apply to this challenge, or how does this apply? I think of all these times as like, well, wait, I've thought of a problem and I need to think about it now. And sometimes it take a while. It'd just be nice to have a community of people who are sort of like grinding on all these different things and had their own ways of articulating. That would be pretty neat, but I don't know. We might not ever get there. This might just be one person talking into the wind, and I'll die someday and nobody will ever talk about it again.
Wow. It's about truth. There's so much talk about that. I bet there's a
Yes.
lot of talk on this. Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a big audience for the conversation wherever somebody might hold their position between Dan and Nad. Hold on.
If I can anticipate the next question of what would make me lower. Sorry, go ahead. Hey, look at that. That's cool. And
this is not a drill, because it's a fastener. It's an impact thing. If you put a drill in it, you'll break the drill. So this is Nad. This is not a drill.
Oh, cool. It's so funny that you say that, because I use tool analogies all the time when I'm talking about this, because using an idea as if it's a tool, like a Phillips head screwdriver is good for some things, but then you set it down when you have a different project. You pick up the remote control when you want to relax and watch TV. So it's funny that it was a tool.
By the way, that red toolbox in the background there, that is Nad's toolbox, and I claim that objectively.
That's cool.
I claim that it corresponds with reality, that the things in that toolbox correspond to that tool.
Well, as Nad should.
Yeah, and I find that correspondence to be maintained as a very useful thing.
Yes.
Okay, anyway, that was just messing with words. Hypothetical down. What could you learn that would weaken your confidence that usefulness was appropriate strategy for dealing with truth?
Yes, I think I would be much less interested in pursuing this sort of experiment in what it's like to kind of think this way. I'd be much less interested if I heard really good, compelling descriptions of what the correspondence specifically is. Like, is it how it's measurable, how it's not axiomatic in its own right?
Okay.
Then, That's the answer. I just need to stop talking sometimes.
Oh, that's okay. I claim that the volume of this cup is just over 12 fluid ounces, or a little under 400 milliliters.
Yes.
Both of those are arbitrary measures.
Yes.
Picked out of the air by scientists for reasons.
Yes.
Does that change the volume of the cup? Is the cup volume in any measure an objective truth?
Oh, well, I think that the idea that the cup has a volume is useful. But I don't see the usefulness of that idea establishing any correspondence itself. So the...
Okay. This claims to be 354 milliliters, or 12 ounces fluid. What would you predict would happen if I pour this into this? Will it overflow? Will it all fit? Will it just barely fit?
Well, I can't remember what you said the useful dimensions of the cup are, but I think it looks like it's pretty close. It looks
I'll
like
change the unit.
Yeah.
I'll change the unit. This cup almost exactly has the volume of this can.
Sure.
And I claim that that's a correspondence with reality.
Okay.
That's a useful thing. Is it true?
Well,
by your standard of truth, I think it's true both ways, right?
Well, in my experiment, I would only be interested in using the word true when I'm sort of assessing how people who aren't me use the word true. There's no good way for me to use the word true in the way that I would. I think it's because culturally it's just like way too confusing.
Let me remove true and I'll say useful and corresponding.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So what would be your confidence that the
we're both struggling with our animals.
Yes, that if I were to pour this into this, it would not overflow. Unless I poured it too fast and it's carbonated.
It's obviously a very useful. That would just be a useful human sentence in circumstances.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm interested in seeing what it's like to not use the word true and not assume that there's the correspondence piece. Like there's nothing measurable between the sentence. The volume of this can will fit exactly into the volume of this cup. I'm interested in seeing what it's like to think that this is a useful sentence or a useful idea for my purposes of drinking a can of soda or whatever out of a cup, like a classy person, instead of that's a useful sentence.
Instead of a drinker out of cans.
It's a useful sentence for some human purposes. But what's it like to not think that there's just not assume that there's correspondence? I think it's anybody's prerogative to do either one based on their own circumstances and interests, I guess.
Okay. Thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Does anybody else in the live show have any further questions they would like to ask? Oh, there's one. Is it beneficial to find out that we are wrong about something, and why? That's 2 questions.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And a big important thing about this too is that a person who's experimenting like I'm experimenting still has observation, reasoning, experimentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can think something an idea is useful, and then have other people kind of come and challenge you on that and say, well, I think you're reasoning poorly on this question, or I think you observed whatever the data is incorrectly somehow, or you missed something, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then that would be useful. If that community member has done a better job of reasoning or a better job of observing or what have you, and they come over and challenge your claim of usefulness, then that would be the equivalent of finding out your thing. And that would also be useful.
Yeah. Yes. Yesterday and the day before, I was in Palm Springs with Reed, and we were doing IRL street epistemology in an area that was near a Starbucks.
Yeah.
And we were joking amongst ourselves, maybe we should do a cash cab thing and offer people a Starbucks for having an interview with us. offer to pay for them to have a Starbucks if they'll talk to
Sure.
us for 15 or 20 minutes about a thing. And of course, there's the downside of we're not really asking. We want this to be so opt-in that we don't actually want to pay people for it. You might not get real genuine SEs, might get something where they think they're just being asked to perform whatever. And ironically, somebody who we were talking to made the same suggestion. Well, maybe you should offer people a Starbucks. And I said,
Oh yeah.
I don't know if we'd want to do that for everybody. It might be expensive, but we could afford it today. We could try it out. Okay, I offer you a Starbucks. I'll buy you a drink if you'll come over and have a conversation with us. I just made an exception.
Yeah.
They didn't take me up on it. Weird. They made the suggestion and it wasn't useful. It's like, what? I'm not sure if this has anything to do with the correspondence. It was just an interesting thought where the person who made the suggestion, it wasn't correspondent with reality.
Yeah.
They weren't going to go for it.
Yeah.
It was fun. So, thank you. And okay, another question from the audience. If something is useful, is it fair to say that it's true that it's oh. Now I have to translate that true to, if I translate that, if something is useful, is it fair to say that it's useful that it's useful?
Is it fair to say
And
that
then that's
it's
a
useful?
tautology. Right, because if you translate true into your useful, then this is a tautology.
I would have to look at that. I think that one way that I would be interested in kind of exploring that question is to if it's a worry about like circularity or something like that, is to just kind of like, I think in an abstract realm, that's a bigger problem where I feel like, it's like, okay, well, there's the physics of a vacuum and then there's like playing pool on the planet Earth. We're talking about like two different realms.
Right.
And
one is oversimplified and the other is
real. So that I think that resolves,
because real stuff does have air resistance.
Yeah. So that's kind of like how I would approach that. And there's more detail to go into on that one, but I think hopefully that kind of clarifies that piece.
Let me try this one the other direction. If something is useful, is it fair to say that it's correspondent with reality that it's useful?
Well, I think that would be Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, it would be anybody's prerogative to want to do that. Yes. Say it again. Is it, if it was useful?
If something is useful, is it fair to say that it corresponds with reality that it's useful?
You're right. It's a very similar.
Yes.
It's a very similar question, I think, and it gets into that circular piece, which I think is really interesting too.
That's fine. Yeah. In future conversations on this topic, I would be so much more equipped if I had actual examples.
Oh, sure.
That would be so much more helpful to me, because then I could make comparisons about things. If I never get down to examples, all we have to do is keep finding defeaters or counterexamples to a general statement and things like that, which I think when we're dealing with something as nuanced as what truth means, we can just keep wrapping that around and around and around and never get to it.
Yeah.
And that might be my correspondence focus.
Right. I see what you mean. Well, the circularity.
I would find it useful to have examples. So sure.
I understand. I'll give an example, a fun example of that circularity one, because I just want to get there. If you feed your video camera picture into your television screen, of course, and then you point your, this old thing where you point, back in the VHS days, you point your video camera at the TV screen, you're feeding it in, you're creating this, the picture on your TV is this, it's a feedback loop.
All over again.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. It doesn't really go to infinity on your TV screen because the TV screen has a resolution to it. It's the same. It's going to eventually
each repeat is an approximation of the prior. And eventually those approximations, the bias in the approximation takes over the image.
So that's how I want to kind of approach some of those circularity questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Cool. Well, this is going to be so if anybody out there wants to talk to Dan about this and wants to engage on it, please just come onto the Discord. harass Dan mercilessly. And you know, if you're willing to buy him a Starbucks, maybe he'll come and talk to you. Okay, so thank you very much. I appreciate the conversation. I guess I'm going to jump to the closings and start for a moment talking about something we did on Monday for the American Atheist Convention. A whole stack of us. So many we couldn't even do into a 10-person Discord. It was like 14 people or something. Did presentations at the American Atheist Convention, all virtual. And we're doing it again on the 26th, 8 p.m. U.S. Eastern. You can register there. My workshop is already full. So are 3 others, I think, 2 or 3 others. So there's room for you, but you might not get to select the workshop you want. I do hear from multiple directions that if there's a lot of demand, that we will make further events of this available either through American Atheists or on our own, or we'll work it out. So if you miss it on this one, we'll come around for you again. Additionally, I understand American Atheist is going to take all the recordings from this, which I think we were successful in getting, and edit it into some kind of a presentation, because again, we were running 7 simultaneous breakout rooms that ran for 75 minutes each. So there's actually a lot of content in what otherwise was really only 2 calendar hours. Enough about that. If you are really into this method of street epistemology, there's a brand new overlay of the site. The site's changed since the last time I had a show, so it looks a little bit better, I think. And it still has most of the same content and is very beautifully organized. This is kind of a one-stop shopping place for the street epistemology community. You can find the Facebook group here, the Discord group here. You can find the SE podcast for those of you who like your SE stuck directly in your ear with all this faffing about in video, stuff like that. Here are 5 of my favorite street epistemology related SE channels. Only 5 really fit on this screen out of about 15 that I recommend on my YouTube webpage. Thank you all for coming to this session of Vanilla Street Epistemology. If you see yourself as able to do what I just did with Dan, well, on either role, however this works, and you'd like to be a guest on this show, all I ask is that you show your face, be polite, be willing to stay on a topic about, if something, at least adjacent to street epistemology, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.